I didn't know Japanese swords were made like this. Why did no one tell me?
It's so time-consuming, and it's definitely dangerous. Let's talk about it.
The process begins inside a secluded workshop in the middle of nowhere. There's a forge, various tools, paintings, certifications, and awards on display. If there is anywhere on Earth where you're most likely to find the Death Note notebook, it's here.
The Swordmaster blacksmith's first task is to collect charcoal from the back of his expensive Lamborghini.
He has purchased multiple crates of charcoal. Upon reaching his workshop, he sets the crates down and starts shoveling the charcoal into the forge,
where the sword will be born. Before going any further, the Swordmaster and his two extremely handsome-looking apprentices.
Look how kawaii and cute they look. Change into traditional Japanese work outfits, otherwise referred to in Japanese as katanakaji shozoku.
This may sometimes consist of hanten or samue, which is a Japanese work jacket often made of cotton or linen.
Then you have the andon bakama, a wide skirt-like pair of pants that allows ease of movement. The tabi is the traditional split-toe socks.
And finally, the waraji, or jikatabi, are those straw sandals or rubber-soled split-toe boots.
Oh, and don't forget the limited edition Ninja Turtle boxers. How could I forget those?
Once the drip has been equipped, they perform a ritual by visiting a shrine to pay their respects.
Actually, many people in Japan believe swords act as talismans for household protection, making them divine objects.
Because of this, the swordsmith has shrine ropes hanging in the workshop. It's really quite beautiful if you think about it.
At the shrine, they offer a bow once, then twice, followed by clapping once and then a second time.
To start the fire, they use an old blacksmithing method instead of your regular modern matches. Ooh, authentic.
This involves taking the iron rod and striking it using a highly specialized tool referred by some as a hammer.
The two apprentices take turns striking the rod with their hammers.
This is how blacksmiths used to light fires way back when. After striking the rod, they roll up a piece of paper.
Not to spark up a joint and get faded, no, although these guys would make the ideal blunt rotation. They place this rolled up paper on the rod's end.
Since the rod is now hot from the strikes, the paper catches fire easily. The burning paper is then placed into the fireplace and covered with charcoal.
Do you see that big box-looking thing next to the fireplace? Yeah, that's called a fuigo.
It's a Japanese box bellows used by swordsmiths and blacksmiths to blow air into a fireplace.
What this does is increase the temperature needed for metalworking.
Unlike cringe Western-style bellows, the fugo operates by sliding a panel back and forth, creating a steady and controlled airflow.
Pretty cool, right? Most of the time people blow with their mouth, no diddy, to strengthen a fire.
But this gizmo makes the process so much easier. Blowing on the fire directly in such conditions would also be hella dangerous.
Due to the extreme heat needed for forging the sword. I mean, you can try it if you want, but you're gonna have to kiss your eyebrows goodbye.
The blacksmiths now prepare to heat the steel. The specific type of steel used is called tamahagane.
They put 2 pieces of tamahagane into the fire and let them heat up. Once heated, they remove the pieces and start hammering them flat. Imagine going through all this just to get bought by a dude on eBay. The main swordmaster holds the tamahagane with large metal tongs, while the other 2 apprentices take turns hammering the living hell out of it. After flattening it slightly, the metal is put back into the fire. This cycle repeats: heat, hammer, reheat, hammer again.
The process continues until the metal is flatter than Taylor Swift. Sorry, Tay-Tay.
Once the desired thickness is achieved, they begin the hardening. The heated metal is splashed into a liquid solution.
The exact liquid is unknown. After quenching the metal,
they break it into smaller pieces.
The Swordmaster explains that the sharp edges of these broken tamahagane pieces are so strong they can even cut glass.
To continue, they proceed to the fourth step, sticking their hands straight into the fire.
Wait, no. No, that's not it, I'm sorry.
I was about to say that the real fourth step is piling the crushed tamahagane pieces onto a clean slab.
To prepare these pieces of tamahagane, the blacksmith applies clay mud over them.
This special mud serves multiple purposes. It prevents oxidation, stops the iron from melting in an unusual way,
and also helps remove impurities. The coated pieces are then carefully placed back into the fire, balanced so none falls off.
It's kind of like Jenga, but for samurai warriors. At this point, an apprentice takes a handful of charcoal and spreads it
like he's sprinkling cheese over a plate of spaghetti. They raise the fire's temperature again and add more charcoal. Next, they start punishing the heated tamahagane once more, pounding away. After reheating it, they move on to the fifth step, creating a slit and folding the metal. To do this, they take a mini Minecraft-looking axe and press it into the center of the red-hot tamahagane. One of the blacksmiths then hammers the axe, forcing it to cut into the metal.
They continue striking until the cut goes about 70% to 80% of the way through. They're edging it, if you will.
Then comes a technique called water hammer. This method creates a vacuum explosion that helps remove impurities from the metal.
The Swordmaster takes water and pours it on the piece of tamahagane, which is already split down the middle, with 80% of the material divided.
Then, as you can see, the dudes hit the tamahagane with hammers repeatedly, following a pattern. Splash of water, hit. Splash of water, hit.
This is repeated multiple times until either A, the iron is purified, or B, a podcast host lets their guest finish a sentence.
The metal is folded over and forged again and again, so that any remaining filth is removed.
The apprentices watch closely, waiting patiently as the work continues. Aren't they handsome? I think I'll name them Chase and Anthony.
One will master the forge, the other will start drop shipping. Okay, here's a question. Have you ever wondered what a Japanese swordsmith eats for lunch? On this particular day, it looks like they caved and Uber Eats some grub.
Wait, what is that? Okay, I see rice, some sort of chicken cutlet, veggies, and an unidentified soup of some kind.
Bro, really? Foot on my ball.
After sufficiently digesting their lunch, followed by dessert, probably a tropical fruit punch flavored vape, it's time for several rounds of folding
and hammering, where the tamahagane begins to form the outer layer of the sword. At this point, the blacksmiths make a fold about 40% up
from the bottom of the piece, then cut and separated. They use special equipment to bend this section after heating it in the fire. The lead blacksmith holds the metal steady,
while another blacksmith strikes it to shape it correctly. With each hit, the metal bends further and further.
This bent piece forms the sword's core iron, known as the soft iron, placed in the middle to give the blade its Hulk-like strength.
The next stage involves boiling and joining the different metal parts together. They apply a clay mixture.
The sword doesn't taste quite as good, though. Regardless, the blade is now placed back into the fire, and the flames turn.
The blade is then transferred back to that straw ash I mentioned earlier, before the blacksmiths resume hammering it. Once this is done, they remove the sword from the fire and cut it, using a plunger to separate the front part. Now they focus on the main section where the handle will be attached. This part is called the nakago. Water is poured over it before hammering the blade into shape. This is where the swordsmith's skill kicks into overdrive.
We do not force the shape, we persuade the steel to align. An ordinary person would mess this up.
One of the apprentices takes over after a while. They inspect the sword by looking straight down its length, checking its alignment.
If necessary, they hit it with a mallet. Once satisfied, the blacksmith sands down the blade.
Next, They paint the blade in a process known as tsuchioki, using a mixture called tsuchi. This is a secret blend of clay, charcoal powder, crushed stone powder, and God knows what else.
It's applied carefully to control which parts of the blade will be hardened. Reminds me of an art class as a sophomore. The blacksmith applies the mixture in multiple layers. The first layer is imprinted with lines, and the second layer is applied on the adjacent side. Once it dries, the blade is ready for the hardening process, which is referred to as yakire. It has to be performed in a darkened room
to avoid outsif light interference. The sword is heated once again, and after reaching the right temperature, it's quickly dunked into water. This is what allegedly gives the sword its soul and unique characteristics. Funny considering its main job is to remove other people's souls.
After cooling, the master blacksmith refines the edge using a whetstone, bringing out the shape of the blade.
Now things are really starting to come together. As the grinding and winding continue, shout out Jamaica, the blade becomes much shinier, revealing its true form. To protect it from rust, a mysterious Shrek swamp water-esque liquid is applied to the blade.
This is actually rust-proofing water. The blacksmith inspects the blade under clear front-facing sunlight, checking it from different angles.
If he notices any remaining bends, he makes little adjustments with the hammer to straighten them out completely.
With the blade now perfected, it's handed over to a sharpener and a sheath maker. Once sharpened, the sword's aura points increase by 1,000.
The sheath that accompanies the sword is made of wood. Though it looks pretty plain at a first glance, it's simple, elegant. Finally, the sheath katana gets wrapped in bubble wrap, because even killers need a cuddle, and is packaged carefully before being sent off to the buyer.
Alright, starting off at number 5 and counting down to number 1, here are the top 5 most brutal, bizarre, and straight up unbelievable facts about Japanese swords.
Number 5. Samurai tested their swords on human bodies.
You know how people test kitchen knives by slicing through paper? Samurai had the same idea, except replace paper with human bodies. No, really. The practice was called tameshigiri, and it involved slicing through human bodies. Corpses, prisoners, unlucky criminals.
If a blade could slice clean through multiple bodies stacked on top of each other.
Number 4. The strongest katanas were folded up to 1,000 times. Legend says that the katanas of...
And while modern metal workers will tell you that number is a little exaggerated, more like a few hundred times, the process was still insane.
Some swordsmiths even went full goblin mode by mixing ground-up human bones into the steel. Number 3. Some samurai swords were so sharp they had to be banned. You know your weapon is too good when the government has to step in.
You see this angry-looking guy on screen? His name was Sengo Muramasa, and he was a famous swordsmith, but not in a wholesome way.
His swords were said to be literally bloodthirsty. The blade supposedly had a thirst for blood so strong that they would force their wielders to murder.
The ruling party in Japan at the time was so convinced that Muramasa blades were cursed that they banned them entirely.
Number 2. Samurai had a 2-sword rule, but one wasn't for fighting. Samurai always carried 2 blades, the katana and the wakizashi.
The dark purpose of the short sword. It was the tool of last resort for oneself. But here's the thing.
AKA self-deletion, self-termination, self-elimination. You get what I'm trying to say. Samurai culture was built around honor, and if you screwed up badly enough, one of your samurai buddies would usually stand by to finish the job.
By relieving you of your head. How kind of him.
The practical use of the short sword. In a cramped hallway or tea room, a long katana is a liability.
Katanas were way too big to be whipping around inside a room. So if you needed to defend yourself in close quarters,
like if someone rudely tried killing you while you were sipping on a nice cup of tea, you'd reach for the smaller blade.
Number 1. The cursed swordsmith who made bloodthirsty blades.
You see this angry-looking guy on screen? His name was Sengo Muramasa, and he was a famous swordsmith.
But not in a wholesome, made-quality weapons kind of way. No,
His swords were said to be literally bloodthirsty.
The blades supposedly had a thirst for blood so strong that they would force their wielders to murder.
The sword allegedly whispered, "More blood, please." And you had no choice in the matter.
The ruling part in Japan at the time was so convinced that Muramasa blades were cursed that they banned them entirely.
After first destroying as many as they could get their hands on. Some samurai were even executed just for being caught with one.
So if you ever come across an old katana in an antique shop and it starts whispering to you, maybe just leave it there.
And now, for a bonus fact. Katanas could slice through guns like butter.
A sword is useless against a gun, right? Wrong.
During Japan's transition into the gunpowder era, samurai actually trained to slice through muskets in battle.
Early firearms were made of relatively soft metals, and a well-crafted katana could cut straight through a musket barrel.
Like it was a breadstick. There are actual recorded tests showing that a properly made katana could slice clean through soft metal gun barrels. Some samurai even practiced deflecting bullets with their swords. Sure, this wasn't a perfect defense.
Turns out bullets kinda hurt. But back in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was a real battlefield strategy.
Imagine trying to shoot a guy only for him to slice your gun in half before you even pull the trigger. That's some straight-up anime-level nonsense.
Except it actually happened. Now, excuse me while I head off into the Japanese mountains in search of a blacksmith.
Who I can pressure into becoming my sensei. But before I go, let me congratulate you.
You now know exactly how Japanese swords are made. And since you're already here, give this next video a watch. It might just shock you. See ya.